Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist once again, and I'm going to be doing one final talk on the topic of my recent interchange with a user by the name of One Faith Ministries, an alleged 5 points Calvinist. Now, in essence, the entire problem that I think him and I have has to do specifically with the fact that although he professes a certain viewpoint, he also asserts something that in many respects reminds me of Neo-Orthodoxy, which basically states that everybody has their opinion, and every opinion in turn essentially amounts to a tradition, and that traditions can all be reconciled and understood between others. In essence, what this viewpoint is predicated by is the belief that there is such a thing as truth, but it's not immediately knowable. So in essence, it might as well not even exist unless we first have it revealed to us by God himself, and this will occur after we've all died. So in essence, they're stating we need not have denominational strife between each other on the grounds that we shouldn't be disagreeing with each other's traditions. I take the opposite view on this. I think that the only reason why denominations should have interchanges and should have debates is on the issue of traditions, because after all, a tradition can be true or false, and there has to be a judge of those traditions, and hence we have the scriptures. Now, One Faith Ministries professes to be a Bible-believing Christian. However, he doesn't really do much work actually citing the scriptures to bolster his viewpoints. Instead, he talks about the history of the Reformed movement. Now, the problem is that his definition of the Reformed movement essentially covers everything that doesn't look like Roman Catholicism to him. So he has a peculiar hostility towards Martin Luther and the Lutherans, probably has a similar hostility towards the Anglicans, but not towards the Methodists, who came directly out of them, essentially, because this guy apparently likes John Wesley a lot. John Wesley, as many of you know, is not reconcilable with the Calvinist view of sovereign grace, and particularly total depravity. It is the assertion of John Wesley that we can reach sinless perfection within this lifetime. Now, naturally, if we take the words of Genesis chapter 2, we could essentially come to the conclusion that if we can come to this state, then by consequence we may well live forever in this life. We may not even have to suffer death, because the penalty of sin is death. And if we come to sinless perfection, then obviously we're no longer under the punishment, either temporally or spiritually, of sin, which is patently ridiculous. But one particular assertion in this particular user's description that essentially rubbed me a bit the wrong way was this particular section right here, and I'll read this. Arminians and Calvinists need to learn to work together. I am reminded of the great theologians George Whitefield and John Wesley. They worked together and brought revival to both England and America. Wesley was an Arminian, and Whitefield was a Calvinist. You know something? Whitefield is one of the few Calvinists that I actually hold in a good measure of contempt. And there's a couple reasons for this, but I'm just going to share with all of you the primary reason. This is taken from the Wikipedia page on dealing specifically with George Whitefield, and it is very plainly and accurately sourced, so there's no denying this. In the early 18th century, slavery was outlawed in Georgia. In 1749, George Whitefield campaigned for its legalization, claiming that the territory would never be prosperous unless farms were able to use slave labor. He began his fourth visit to America in 1751, advocating slavery, viewing its relegalization in Georgia as necessary to make his plantation profitable. partially through his campaigns and written pleas to the Georgia trustees, it was relegalized in 1751. Whitefield became a slave owner, using them to work his the Bethesda orphanage. To help raise money for the orphanage, he also put slaves to work in a plantation called Providence. Whitefield was known to treat his slaves well. They were reputed to be devoted to him, and he was critical of the abuse and neglect of their slaves by other owners. When Whitefield died, he bequeathed his slaves to the Countess of Huntingdon. And the thing is that, I am a very strong opponent of slave labor. I don't have the woefully unrealistic view of history that most post-abolitionists have in thinking that civil war, and the deaths of thousands upon thousands of Americans was the only way to remedy this problem. But I find slavery repugnant, and most people today tend to agree with me on this. It's impossible to hold Whitefield in esteem with regards to his so-called works when we take this into account. It's just as simple as that. And also we have to bear in mind also that Wesley himself was supposedly a great opponent of slavery. Probably one of the few things I agree with him on. How do you reconcile those two viewpoints? One supports slavery, one doesn't. How do we work together on that issue when we're on divergent sides of the issue? This is the problem that I have with people who think the way that this individual does. We can't all simply get together and believe all the things that we want to believe, hold our own opinions, and then call ourselves one faith, because we're not one faith. And in regards to John Wesley, well, he wasn't a particularly admirable character either, particularly when we look at his relationship with Augustus Montague Toplady, who was a Calvinist minister in England. And I'm going to read just a little bit from his Wikipedia page as well. The relationship between Toplady and Wesley had been initially cordial, involving exchanges of letters in Toplady's Arminian days, and they became increasingly bitter and reached its nadir with the Zacchaeus affair. Wesley took exception to the publication of Toplady's translation of Zacchaeus's work on predestination in 1769, and he in turn published an abridgment of that work titled The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination, Stated and Asserted, adding his own comment that the sum of all this is 1 in 20 supposed of mankind are elect, 19 in 20 are reprobated. The elect shall be saved, do what they will, the reprobate will be damned, do what they can. Reader, believe this, or be damned. Witness my hand. Toplady viewed the abridgment and comments as a distortion of his and Zacchaeus' views, and was particularly enraged that the authorship of these editions were attributed to him as though he approved of the content. What this means, when brought into more basic terminology, is that Wesley essentially violated copyright laws and copied a work that was done by someone else, put it under that person's name, and added things to it that the original author never put into it. This is one of the most dishonest things that a person can do within the realm of print media in general, and it is doubly offensive when it's done in the context of theological debate. How can you hold someone like John Wesley in esteem from a standpoint of works, which is what this individual, One's Faith Ministries, is asserting, when a person does stuff like this? This individual claims that he is no respecter of persons and he subordinates himself to the will of Scripture, and yet look at the people that he cites as examples of good Christian conduct. I mean, He asserts that Martin Luther was some kind of raging anti-Semite because he denounced rabbis for teaching anti-Christian rubbish. He definitely went a little bit overboard regarding his proposed solutions to this problem, but really, just about everybody that you encounter in Christian history is a sinner. And the minute that you become a respecter of persons, you engage in hypocrisy, and that is exactly what people like this do. They claim that they are not respecters of persons and that they only follow the Bible, and yet every other word out of their mouths out of this essentially works to the contrary. My standpoint on this is simple. John Wesley, George Whitefield, the whole lot of them, in terms of scriptural truth, they can only be useful if the works that they have committed can help simplify the understanding of Christian doctrine. In this respect, Whitefield might be on some level profitable, but really most of his major works are interchangeable and inferior to other works by other preachers. And Wesley's theology is utterly useless and wholly Christless. That's my take on it. And I believe that my take on it is backed up by Scripture. Otherwise, I would not believe it. So until next time, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, God be with you all.